Hello, welcome to our debate for person first language versus identity first language. The members of our group are David as our person first stater, Karen as our moderator and identity first stater, Karis as our person first prover and attacker, and Jack as our identity first prover and attacker. Some of the debate rules for today, the speakers are expected to be clear, concise, and speak freely without reading from notes. Be respectful to the opposing side speaking and do not interrupt. You must wait your turn. Present arguments within the allotted 5 minutes. You can finish early, but you cannot go over your time limit. Provide supportive evidence with all arguments. Facts must be accurate. Refrain from changing points of view during the debate and refrain from introducing new points during the rebuttal. Up first, we do have our person first stater, David.
Welcome, everyone. I would like to extend my respect to the opposing team as we are all gathered here and have put a great amount of work into discussing this motion. Should person first language or identity first language be used? I have this great opportunity in the opening argument in the person first language to introduce the key points, and those are the reduction of stigma, the respect and empathy, promoting individualism, the awareness and educational impacts. And up next is Karen, as she is the identity first stater.
Okay. So it has been discussed by Dunn and Andrews that people with disabilities are said to be part of an invisible minority, and disability should be included as an important part of human diversity. So using identity first language has been aligned with what's called the minority model, and disability could also be seen as just as equally important as other minority groups, such as like our race, gender, and ethnicity. Also, according to Gernsbacher, he made the point to suggest that to consider autism as an unimportant characteristic of an individual, the implicit message is to send that autism as a negative characteristic. So using the identity first language respects all parts to an individual's identity, but it can also provide that positive link to disability culture, can help reduce stigma of their disability, and not being seen as a deficit. So identity first has been recognized by several groups, those that have been diagnosed with like autism, deafness, ADHD. However, there has been a stigma using the person first language in scholarly writing. And so that's something that we'll be expanding on today. But first, I just wanted to go over just a couple of quick snippets of, if you'll hit next slide, with some of the differences of person versus identity first language. As you'll see here, person first is identifying the person as a human being. Rather, identity first is identifying as the disability itself. And so one of the things that has been considered, I guess, as important when with person first is that it's been identified a lot more in journal articles rather than identity first is with activists. And so this is something that we'll be going through in more depth through our debate today. So moving on, our first up is our person first prover, Karis.
Hello, I'm going to start with proving the points that David had discussed earlier, supporting them with some data from different studies that were conducted. Additionally, as we're talking about reducing the stigma and societal stereotypes that come with using person-first language. Person-first language can help reduce the stigma that's associated with autism by separating the person from the condition. This point is supported in an article written by Boojman in 2023 that states the words we use to describe autism and people with autism reflect and shape the way we think about autism, and words may therefore unintentionally contribute to stigmatization. Language influences perception. Using person-first language shifts public perception to view individuals with autism as people first, reducing negative stereotypes and promoting a more positive, inclusive view. As you look into point 2, individuals with autism are more than their diagnosis. This was a little bit discussed previously, as I just quoted from an article. However, person-first language also helps to address and reduce societal stereotypes. The article that was quoted above also states stigmatization of autistic persons includes society ascribing stereotypical traits to person on the spectrum and consequently defining them by their autism instead of perceiving every autistic person as a unique individual. People with autism tend to already have the emotion within their head as though they are different than others. So being able to prove to them and support them and make them feel as though they are the same besides their diagnosis, using the person-first language can help reduce this stigma that's associated with that, such as saying persons with autism emphasizes the individual's unique identity beyond their diagnosis, which can mitigate any negative perceptions of individuals with autism. The last point that we're going to talk about here on my side is the broader disability rights movement. This kind of goes into more of individualism and can also kind of tie into respect and empathy. The person-first language acknowledges that individuals with autism are just more than their diagnosis. This point is also supported by an article that was written by Simon Berry. It includes that participants have expressed that autism is only part of their identity or stress their humanity first. This ties into the Ethics Code 1.10, which states awareness of personal biases and challenges. Person-first language acknowledges that individuals with autism are more than their diagnosis. It emphasizes their individuality and ensures that they are seen as a personal first and foremost, which leads to greater acceptance and understanding. Also, person-first language can foster greater empathy and respect by explicitly putting the person before the condition. It helps encourage a mindset that prioritizes human dignity and individual worth. Person first is consistent with the broader disability advocacy movement, which emphasizes recognizing individuals as people first, before any condition or disability they might have. Berry also states that person-first language is consistent with the broader disability rights movement to promote respect and dignity for individuals with disability. It underscores the importance of recognizing individuals as people first, not defined solely by their condition. This aligns with the principles of this movement by promoting respect and dignity by prioritizing the person over the disability. So being able to kind of take into consideration how they are feeling as they receive these diagnoses is also important, but being able to support them and get behind that they are individuals with or without their diagnosis is also extremely important for society.
All right, next up we have Jack with Identity First Prover.
So I think it's important to note that the first People First movement was seen in 1968 in Sweden, and it was originally founded as a meeting for parents for developmentally disabled children. And that same group actually claimed the interesting motto of "We speak for them." And the first person movements in the United States, called People First, were in the 1970s. By shifting to the use of first person language, we are stripping disabled people from feeling a sense of community and forcing them to mask their disability and always refer to it second and not first. By using person first language, we are not allowing disabled people to be proud of who they are. Masking is a direct result of an autistic person possibly understanding on a fundamental level or feeling like they are not welcome in society, perhaps without fully understanding why. In order to mask, autistic people develop many repertoires that we see all the time. Some of these repertoires include using select phrases during certain social interactions. They may feel the need to constantly monitor their facial expressions, hide stimming behaviors, and even possibly practice certain interactions ahead of time. And it's been also been seen that people with autism, autistic people have been known to research social norms of neurotypical people. It was found in a study by Laura Hall and others that there's a linear correlation between masking and the symptoms of generalized anxiety, depression, social anxiety, which can all lead to a higher likelihood of poor mental health. So using language like identity first that embraces an autistic individual's identity really just fosters a safe, healthy space where masking is either less necessary or not necessary at all. And this means less anxiety, stress, and overall less psychological distress for autistic people. And using identity first also promotes the link to disability culture, which means promoting a sense of community, connection, and shared purpose across which is seen to be the largest minority group in the United States, according to the Department of Labor and the U.S. Census in 2021. Disabled people make up 27% of civilian population, which is about 42.5 million people. And while this is the largest minority group, it's possibly the most marginalized and underrepresented. When we look at diversity in a broader scope, having a disability, no matter what it is often overlooked in the difference in the spectrum of diversity. And according to the state of Kentucky, their Department of Education, the spectrum of diversity refers to the differences individuals have in age, gender, mental health, family status, parental status, physical and mental abilities, race, ethnicity, religion, and even socioeconomic status. By using identity first language, we can promote the spectrum of diversity by addressing people by what makes them unique. In this case, it would be their disability. Next slide.
And we'll be going back to Karis as our person first attacker.
So as we go into a different point, obviously we are still kind of focusing on respecting individual preferences, but this can also become a huge point in human dignity and individual worth. So a lot of this takes place with the awareness and educational impact that person first language has on society. Person first language can be an important tool in awareness and educational campaigns by shaping public perceptions in a more inclusive and respectful manner. A study conducted by Simon Bray suggests that person first language can be an important tool. It helps shape public perceptions and is more inclusive and respectful, which is crucial to effective advocacy and support. By using person first language in campaigns and educational materials, we can foster a more understanding and supportive society that values individuals with autism for their unique contributions and perspectives. However, as though you did talk about being able to mask society and you believe that it is increased, I also found some information regarding the other side of it where, while in identity first language is often argued to recognize autism as a vital part of an individual's identity, Boojman highlights a critical distinction that both proponents of identity first language and person first language may see autism as central to identity. This suggests that the term identity first language might not be the most appropriate or sufficient descriptor. If individuals are consistently referred to by their condition, example, autistic person, it reinforces the notion that their identity is defined by autism, potentially increasing the pressure to conform a societal normal or mask their true selves. This doesn't always qualify to autism. It also can qualify to any form of disorder or diagnosis. However, using person first language helps create more of an inclusive environment. In educational settings, person first language helps create a more inclusive environment for students with autism. It promotes understanding and acceptance among peers, which is vital for fostering a supportive and inclusive community. Person first language emphasizes the individuality of students with autism, encouraging peers to see them as individuals first. This can lead to a greater acceptance and inclusion within the classroom and school community. A lot of children with autism maybe spending a lot of their time in the classroom due to requiring any form of educational assistance. So while individuals with autism may prefer identity first language, using person first language acknowledges and respects the preferences of a broader group, including parents and educators, fostering respectful communication. This final last point also discusses not one singular correct way. So while the debate is between identity first and person first language, it often centers around the notion of identity and how to best honor it. Boojman points out that supporters of both language styles value the identity of individuals with autism. Therefore, it is not accurate to claim that identity first language uniquely respects the integral role of autism in one's identity. Person first language, by placing the person before the condition, can also acknowledge the importance of autism in shaping an individual's experience and identity without reducing them solely to their condition. The insight provided by this article challenges that the assumption of identity first language is inherently superior in acknowledging that significance of autism. Since both language proponents value the identity of individuals with autism, the exclusive emphasis on identity first language as the identity respecting choice is just misleading. As we kind of wrap up the person first language, obviously the whole goal of person first language is to aim to prevent the objectification of individuals by ensuring their condition does not overshadow their humanity. By placing the person before the condition, person first language promotes a more holistic and respectful view of individuals, recognizing that identity encompasses much more than just their diagnosis.
And we'll lead into Jack with being the identity first attacker.
Identity first language celebrates the concept of neurodiversity. The Harvard School of Medicine defines neurodiversity as the idea that people experience, interact with the world around them in many different ways, prompting that there is no one right way of thinking, learning, behaving, and most importantly, it emphasizes that differences are not viewed as deficits. Using person first language does not celebrate neurodiversity. In fact, it sends the opposite message, saying that person's disability is not an important characteristic, and they are not part of a larger, more diverse group. By using identity first language, we can celebrate neurodiversity by promoting the sense of all together neurodiverse community and forming unity between those who are not characterized in quotations as neurotypical. And I think it needs to be also noted that when we use person first language, we send an implicit message that a disability is a negative characteristic. As a society, we often use person first language while referring to someone who has possibly a disease who is unwanted. That is unwanted. For example, we say a person with cancer, not a cancerous person. And when addressing people with admirable traits, we often refer to those traits in an identity first layout. For example, we say a kind person, not usually a person with kindness. Those outside of the sphere of working with disabled people might make the immediate association in their brain and how we act in society and correlate having a disability as a negative characteristic. And I think it's also important to bring up the issue of ableism. The Journal of Teaching Disability Studies defines ableism as characterizing persons as defined by their disability as inferior to people who are non-disabled. This relates to person first language because this restricts disabled people the freedom to determine what is best for their community. For example, person first language was written into law in 1990 as part of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was put into law in 1997. These laws made person first language the law to use in scholarly writing and medical practice all over. And Karis, you brought up the point of having an individual's preference, but I think that when we put into laws that we have to use a specific one type of language, then I think that restricts the people's freedom to be referred to however they want. And when looking over those laws, a few questions pop up in my mind. Was this law the preference of all disabled people? Why is it required by law to use language that was or maybe still is not completely accepted with all disabled communities? And was this law made because lawmakers thought disabled people aren't capable of deciding how they want to be referred to? Next slide.
Okay, And we will go back with David as the person first stater.
All right, thank you. So both Carice and Jack had mentioned under the person first and the identity first about advocacy groups, and various advocacy groups and organizations have historically supported the person first, indicating a broader acceptance of its values and promoting respect. And as Carice had mentioned before from Bury, that the person first language is consistent with the broader disability advocacy movement. So as we look at the last 2 points on here, it said in 1974, the first self-advocacy conference was held in the US, which Jack had mentioned, coming in the 1970s. And then in 1990s, the American Psychological Association led the movement toward the use of the person first language, which Jack had also mentioned was kind of the start to the laws being proposed as far as what we're using for medical and for the scholarly reviewed journals. I just want to keep known that the person first is just simply to respect and show that there's no stigma that is really placed on, or there is a stigma that is placed on those people, and we are working towards keeping the person separate from the disability or whatever it is that they're being defined as. And next slide, and up next will be Karen as the identity first stater.
All right, thank you, David. So wrapping up on the identity first, keep in mind, it's been discussed by both sides that reducing stigma has been the priority. However, stigma has been widely placed on disability by society as a whole. So it's been said by Gernsbacher that numerous disability scholars have argued that person first language may have actually overcorrected to the point of further stigmatizing disability. So utilizing identity first in a way places control back into the hands of those with the disability. So according to Dunn and Andrews, using identity first language is an attempt to reclaim that negative connotation to having a disability and leads it back to having a more neutral term in the disability community. So to that end, I'm going to leave it with a statement from a disability activist who's also an autistic person. Her name is Lydia Brown. She argued that it's impossible to separate a person from autism, just as it is impossible to separate a person from the color of his or her skin. Next slide. So in closing, there was a survey conducted by Dunn and Andrews that did provide respondents the ability to select what their preference was, and the majority did select person with a disability as their preference, while the remainder did choose disabled person, non-disabled person, or able-bodied person. But that was to a lower percentage when 70% were selecting person with a disability. However, because the lack of research and studies that have been performed to this point, there's just not enough to support the conversation of person first and identity first with enough solid data, considering that the laws that imposed in the ADA and the IDEA Act do state the preferred preference is person first. However, closing out, I think it's important to consider that language preference is going to be dependent on a disability diagnosis. Next slide. So looking at some of the communities that fall under person first and identity first, we see that those with Down syndrome or even those with a mental illness, may lean towards person-first language, while those that are either autistic or blind, they may lean towards the identity first. And ultimately, we have to consider that we may need to use both of these language interchangeably, because the preference of our individual people that we work with, the roles and perspectives of both of those identities are important. So discussing the preferred disability identities and terminology with our clients will actually support the relationships that we build. And so one final example is an article called Concerns About ABA-Based Interventions and an Evaluation and Recommendation. They use a statement that says the terminology was selected to adhere to the 7th edition of the American Psychology Association Publication Manual and to be inclusive to those who prefer person first as well as identity first. So while the person first is the preferred language for any scholarly writing, it has been recommended that for future publications of the APA manual, to allow for these languages to be used interchangeably, to be able to respect both identities. So that leads us into our question and answer session. We do have some questions from the audience. David?
Okay, and we have one question for the prover side and one for the identity side. And the first question states for the prover is, can you explain how to respect others and promote individualism?
Yeah, so based on the questions from the audience, I kind of wanted to touch base on this question specifically because I think that respect and empathy towards these individuals is one of the most important processes of allowing them to feel like they are accepted. Respect is the admiration for someone elicited by their abilities, qualities, and or achievements. Thus, promoting individualism or individuality using person-first language helps us see the person first. According to Boojman, I can kind of tie back into the article that was discussed earlier. The appropriate choice of language should be determined by the context and the preferences of the individuals that are involved. By adopting person-first language, we are more likely to respect the wishes of individuals, which allows us to promote the view that a person is not solely defined by their disability, but had a complex. Respect or admiration for someone is something that everyone deserves. We should be treated as individuals, and as such, persons with autism are more than just their diagnosis. They should be seen as people first.
Thank you so much. And for the last question, this will be for the identity side. This says, if ableism is prevalent in lawmaking and society in general, what are steps that can be taken to identify where it occurs and how to address it?
I think that unfortunately, ableism is something that is systemic, much like racism, and unfortunately, it is something that is taught in society, and it's just a large stigma in society. But I think we can tie it back to how Harvard defined neurodiversity and celebrating neurodiversity, especially the last line that states that we can't view differences as deficits. And I think that unfortunately, while all of us who care a lot about this topic, we can't write to government and change laws tomorrow. However, we can do things like spreading awareness around clinics or with family, stuff like that, to really be able to spread the word of ableism and how to avoid it, how to address it, and how to see it in different settings.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, that concludes our debate over the person first language and the identity first language. Thank you everyone for joining us today.